Command Mechanized. This is Rules and Nuances, Part 1. When you think about the basic components of Hex Command Mechanized, obviously it's all the materials you would imagine would be found in a World War II setting. For instance, you'd have tanks and all fully tracked vehicles, as well as partially tracked and wheeled armored cars and lighter vehicles of that nature. Also, you would have other vehicles and trucks, Jeeps, Bren carriers, Kubelwagens, all different kinds of sundry vehicles that would be utilized by an army. Basically lightly armored, no armored, soft-skinned, or just basically your support vehicles. And of course you have your infantry, various weapons, rifles, machine guns, heavy machine guns, and specialized infantry functions like that, as well as mortars and light machine guns as well. You have artillery and anti-tank guns, a variety of sizes and shapes, and specialist forces as well, like engineers. And you also have naval and aircraft for those kinds of scenarios that those are involved in. Okay, so basically what we want to do is first cover the issue of tanks. These are fully tracked vehicles that are intended for moving across country in a much more with a much greater level of integrity and maneuverability than wheeled vehicles. And that's the big distinction here, that wheeled vehicles are fine for certain types of ground that isn't a road, but tanks are universally possible, that is to say, of all off-road movement. And in the basic Hex Command system, we're talking about light vehicles. Now notice how we haven't mentioned very light tracked vehicles. They would be moving 1 hex further. So light vehicles, light tanks are moving 4 hexes per turn. This is across country. Medium tanks are 3 hexes per turn, and heavy are 2 hexes per turn. When moving on a road, you're going to add half and round up. The other stipulation that's important to remember is that light vehicles can change their facing twice per turn. Now what that means is they can change 1 hex side facing and then do something, and then change a face again when they've got to that point that they want to do it. Other vehicles can only make 1 hex side facing change per turn, either at the beginning, middle, or end of their turn. Anytime in their movement they wish to change their facing, they're allowed to do it.
Okay, in this segment, let's talk about the use of turrets on tanks. There are certain parameters of the use of a turret that at least should be withheld or maintained, I should say, into the even simpler rules for Hex Command. And these are essentially, the turrets can turn any amount, but they can do it once, and they can do this each turn. So in Hex Command, the usual Hex Command, the normal Hex Command rules, it's a -1 combat penalty, but that same penalty carries over into the faster Hex Command rules. We still have a -1 combat penalty. And don't forget, by the way, the arc is very important in the game as well. The reason being that arcs for some weapons can differ from other weapons. And the arc of fire is what tells you what's in your field that you can shoot at without having to incur a penalty by moving again or by turning the turret. Other tanks that we'll discuss in a moment have a different kind of arc. And because of their configuration, the way the tanks are designed, they can't always shoot everything that you can see. You have to turn your vehicle. Those are called self-propelled guns, or in the case of turreted tanks, you got to turn the turret. But in either case, you have to remember that there's a certain degree or width of field coming from the vehicle because of the way that the tank is designed. Either the gun, the way it's mounted into the turret, or into the body in the case of self-propelled guns. Okay, so when we talk about the different types of tanks, we were mentioning before that they're the self-propelled guns or SP guns, and even amongst these, there's different kinds. There's just an enormous variety, especially during World War II when the vehicle was developed. It's basically a vehicle that doesn't have a turret. So it's less expensive to produce, and they can produce more of them. And sometimes, however, that also means that they have less armor. The armor is not as thick. It may be not as stylized so as to deflect incoming shots. But on the other hand, sometimes because of the fact that they don't have the turret, they can actually carry a bigger gun. Most of the time, again, because of the fact there's no turret, it means they're lighter and they're easier to hide. They're kind of a stealth weapon, or they're an ambush weapon. So and it's a steady platform. So the weapon it's very steady. It doesn't have all that turret mechanism and stuff to bounce around. So it's a very steady platform. And we give it a bonus in the rules, which we'll show later. But when it comes to stealth and easier to hide, this thing definitely does not apply. This is the Jag Tiger, a ridiculous version of the self-propelled gun. The Germans developed this toward the end of the war, and it's just absolutely the obscene degree of self-propelled gun. It's a heavy tank, a very heavy tank. The armor's very thick, and as you can see, it's sloped. And the thing is, it's just a behemoth. It's absolutely massive, and it's got the most powerful gun in the world. It was a 128 millimeter naval gun, and it would just destroy anything it hit. There's nothing that would stand up to this tank weapon. No tank is impervious to the shell that this thing fired. And of course, because of that, also bear in mind, its rate of fire is very slow. It only fires a shell every couple of moments, whatever those moments are. But in other words, it's not going to fire as fast as a normal tank gun, a regular tank gun, because the gun is so big and the powder charge is so big. Anyway, so the tank itself is vulnerable because it has treads. So they went and spent all the resources to make this tank, and the thing is that the treads themselves can be taken out by a minor tank gun. So what you do is, when you're fighting one of these things, is in real life anyway, not in the game, but in the real life, you go and shoot for the tread. You'll never knock it out, but thank God it doesn't have a turret, because the whole thing has to turn in order to get you in its vision, in order for it to fire at you. The whole tank has to turn. Well, look at it. It's huge. There's no way you're going to turn that thing quickly. That's going to turn very, very slow. That's a very heavy tank. Now, as opposed to something like this. And by the way, I've scaled this down to give you the approximate idea of how big the difference is between these two. The one on the right that I just brought up here, that's the Hetzer. That is one of my favorites, and everybody loves this little tank, except, of course, the people that drive them, because there is absolutely no room in this vehicle for anything. You can hardly breathe in this vehicle. As a matter of fact, when it was engaged in combat, they basically had to open as many hatches as possible because it was absolutely stifling. You can see in this case, the armor is extremely sloped. The reason for this is because the armor is very, very thin. So when you have very sloped armor, it compensates for the thinness of the armor by almost acting like very thick armor. So at a long distance, anybody that shoots this thing is actually shooting at a tank that's behaving like a heavy armored tank. But it's not. As you can see by the wheel configuration, the tread configuration, this is essentially a light tank. This was built off the 38T chassis, a Czechoslovakian design that the Germans inherited when they took over the Sudetenland and all the factories and such. So this is actually a really cool, nice, and all the gamers love to see these little guys out there. You can see the difference in the guns too. This is the normal, if you want to call it that, German anti-tank gun. 75 millimeter, but a very effective gun. Okay, very effective gun regardless. It's still one of the better guns of the war, certainly better than the American 75. And good penetration, long range, and now it's on a steady gun platform. So it doesn't have a turret, and it's a fast little bugger, and the benefits are enormous. This, if you had a whole bunch of these things running around, you could probably have a pretty good chance of defeating the enemy in any regard. But again, these things are translated to the rules. So in the basic hex command and the fast hex command system, we're talking about a +1 combat bonus for all these kinds of weapons. Be they really huge, mounted very, very tall, or mounted very low to the ground. The fact is it's a steadier gun platform, and we give it a +1 when it shoots. And here is, again, a visual difference. Look at the height difference in this little drawing. The firing at the top tank is going to be a lot easier from a distance than firing at the bottom tank, and that's called a low silhouette. Now, in the advanced or in the basic hex command, we give a -1 when you shoot at these vehicles because they're very, very low to the ground. In the fast hex command system, we're not going to be concerned about that. You can if you want, but it's another detail that we're going to leave out so that the game progresses very quickly. A tank is going to be a tank, and the only difference here, of course, is that when you have a steady gun in the fast hex command system, just like in the basic hex command, you get a +1. But when you fire at them, it's not going to be a -1 to fire. You can do it if you like, but we're just not going to put it in at this moment. I mean, in the basic concept of making the game go faster. So it's one less thing to remember, but it depends if you want to use it or not. And so here's another image right here that shows you the arc. Let's not forget about the arc. The whole point of the SP guns is that their arc is limited. They can only shoot what's exactly directly in their hexagon, what's exactly in their field. If you don't use a hexagon grid, it's very simple. It's whatever is between the treads of the tank. You can hit, and I know that's going to sound very bad because not much stuff is going to be in between the treads of the vehicle for you to shoot at it. Well, I mean, that's just the way it is. You're getting a +1 combat bonus, but your arc is very limited. So what's the point of these vehicles? Well, the point of these vehicles is that's a pun right there. You point it exactly where you want it to go, and you go right at that item, and then you shoot that item. That is the idea of a self-propelled gun. It's an assault weapon that just goes straight ahead and it shoots what's in its arc. Whatever comes into its field of fire, it shoots at. And that's all there is to it. And, heaven help you if you don't have infantry with you, because the tank's self-propelled guns are so vulnerable to side attack because, again, they don't have turrets. So that is the point and the issues of self-propelled guns. Okay, so we've talked about tanks and the variations um, that were available during the war. Actually, what we'll talk about here is armored cars. They had an enormous variety, but they still had some basics, and we'll talk about them now. First of all, they're very light in their weight class. These are basically trucks and big jeeps, and they're maybe not too quiet. But the fact is, a crew of between 3 to 4, I suppose, in for the most part, and probably just 3 actually, and in some cases maybe just 2, the gunner commander and the driver. The other thing is that they were, of course, very fast, but the thing is, not that fast across country, unless, of course, they're tracked. There were some armored cars. The Russians had an armored car. They had wheels in the front, but they had tracks in the back. That was a variation of the fully wheeled vehicle. Still, so they wouldn't get stuck in the ground and the ground clutter. But they really are meant for smooth, relatively smooth terrain and roads. And their objective, of course, the reason for the existence of armored cars is to get somewhere fast. And why you want to get somewhere fast is because of reconnaissance. You basically want to find out what is in the enemy's arsenal, what he's got, where he's at, and then call for help. So most every armored car is going to be equipped with a radio of some kind and some strength, so they can communicate. The whole point of the armored car is to be able to communicate, and their function was not battle, but their function is to spot the enemy position. So essentially, that means you don't use you don't use armored cars in the attack role. But again, the curious thing is, depending on the scenario, the enemy's orientation, what he's looking like, uh, maybe it's early morning or something. He's not fully aware of what you're doing. But the fact is, you don't want to attack with these vehicles unless the enemy allows you to attack, unless you know enough about what the enemy is, that you can pretty much judge that you can make a lightning strike with these little armored guys, and cause some damage before then, of course, running away. Because what you want to do is you want to get there, do some damage, find out what he's got further, and then call in the heavy stuff afterwards. So that's essentially the long and the short of armored cars. And essentially, this is the same in the Hex Command regular system as it is in the Hex Command simple or light system. There's no real difference here for movement or turrets or anything like that. All those same rules still apply. So that's essentially the idea. Armored cars are just very light vehicles, and their idea is to just wreak havoc wherever they can, and not stick around too long, and don't get too close. Close enough to make your gun effective, but not too close to the enemy's anti-tank guns that you're going to lose your armored cars. Now, of course, there have been situations, and we've seen this many times, where people are using armored cars as like cavalry, to completely toss it into the enemy's lines and chew him up, because essentially, like we'll see in the next slide, they didn't just have fast firing small caliber guns, but they also had machine guns. So essentially, your crew is pretty much protected from the light or very light weaponry of the enemy, and so you could do some distracting damage, and you could take a group of, or a platoon of armored cars, and go and grab a bridge or a vital crossing or an intersection, and once you're there, you can lead the way for your forces to build up a defensive perimeter, or determine where to go next. So the idea is for armored cars to find out what's going on, and report their findings. So they're the eyes and the ears of the army, essentially. Because one thing that's very important to remember is that in this day and age, in World War II, you didn't have this radio communication to jets or to the aircraft above. It just wasn't there yet. So you couldn't just use an armored car to say, hey, I'm going to call now an airstrike. It didn't work that way. But we'll get into those tactics and so on later on.
Okay, so here are a couple of examples of our armored cars. I wish we had more time to give you a better summary of just how many armored cars there are, but there are a lot. One of the reasons that, just because it reminds us of Car Wars, but it is true. There are times when we just play World War II games with all these vehicles. We've had a couple of armored car games that have actually come out a lot. They're a lot of fun, which is to say, they're cool. I mean, you're talking about guns with cars with guns, essentially, and they're armor plated, right? So it's not like they're plastic, polymer or anything like that. In the future, these are metal, heavy. But for the most part, they're still light or very light armored vehicles. Okay, so coffee time here. Hold on. Okay, so what we're looking at here is at the bottom, two views of the British Hummer armored car. Now, this is a cute little guy. I think it was the crew of 3. 14.7 millimeter heavy machine gun. I believe it was called a Besa. I don't know if that was the manufacturer or what. But again, you can see the common denominator here is get off the ground, keep it high, surmount any of those rocks and bad things that are on the ground, and get to where you want to go and find out and report. And these are all turreted armored cars. You can see that it's pretty dramatically sloped in front, but on the side not so much. But still, deflective angles for small arms fire. And let me stress, these vehicles are not intended to take anything but small arms fire, if anything at all, and shrapnel. They are not intended to survive anything larger. In some cases, actually, I should caution there, they probably wouldn't be able to take their fire from their own size weapon. But anyway, their intention is to get up there, find out what's going on, report, and to be the eyes and ears. That is the top left-hand corner. We have the Daimler armored car. On the bottom is the Hummer. Two views. The Daimler, they're both premier, you would say, in the desert, and then brought into Europe. But obviously, at the point of the invasion, the usefulness of these vehicles is really just in spotting. And I suppose in that role, they would have a fairly long distance radio per se, and specific to what they were or who they were communicating to. Probably not communicating to aerial, but through the various channels of communication, whatever these guys might report would get to the aerial spotters, and these guys would be in command, in control, or in communication with planes. Top right hand corner, we have the one of our, again, I say favorite, but I'll explain that in a second. One of our favorites is the SDKFC German 222 armored car. Heavily angled, nice design, and that's why we like these things. We like to see smart engineering and designs. Now, as far as we know, all the engines and the integrity of these vehicles was all there. That's why we like these vehicles. Besides, in a sense, they're kind of cute. They look neat. They look very compact. They're nicely suited for what their role is. And in the 222's case, its turret is open-topped, and there's a mesh netting on top that would split open and allow the occupants to exit the vehicle. I don't believe there's any side doors. None of these guys actually have side doors. These are all entering in from the top. Actually, in the Daimler's case below, or a Hummer below, I think there's a side entrance there, hatch right there. But anyway, so that's what these guys are. Very light armored cars, and these are good examples. The 222 is armed with a 20 millimeter rapid firing essentially anti-aircraft machine gun, and I believe it was clip fed, so it had something like, I don't know, 20 rounds or something in the clip. And the other now the top left hand corner, we have the Daimler. That was a 2-pounder, so a 40 millimeter anti-tank gun was installed in the Daimler. And of course, later on in the war, all of these saw upgrades, heavier guns, some added armor so that they could withstand more in their than their role of being the eyes and ears. So these are good examples.